Tell me what would not give the enemies of this country more aid and comfort than to realize that that fundamental part of our federal defense system is being destroyed from within. We need to use the reserve powers of the states because Congress is not going to do this. Congress is wedded to the Federal Reserve System, and Congress is wedded to not use gold and silver as normal day-to-day currency. It's out there, and people buy it, and they put it in safe deposit boxes, right? But they're not paying their debts with it. Congress is not interested in that. The states have the authority to make that system available, and then we see what happens.
This is Donegan Kaiser, founder of Liberty and Finance. I'm now a licensed gold and silver dealer with Miles Franklin. Call me directly for the physical gold and silver that you need at the best price with personalized, private service from one of the oldest and best respected companies in the business. 30 years strong, A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, 0 complaints, licensed and bonded, insured delivery or vault storage or IRAs, excellent prices, privacy and confidentiality, pay by check, money order, ACH or wire, satisfaction guaranteed. Call me directly at 419-819-9209 or my associate at 310-562-6400 or email us at kaiser@milesfranklin.com. Welcome back to Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers. We have a returning guest we're always privileged to have. This is Dr. Edwin Vieira. He is a constitutional attorney. He holds PhD and JD from Harvard, as well as several other degrees. He's written extensively on the Second Amendment, on constitutional money, and he's here to talk about both of those topics today. Dr. Vieira, thank you again for joining us on Liberty and Finance.
My pleasure to be with you, as usual.
We wanted to get you to weigh in on two topics that are in the news. Right now we have a new piece of legislation going through the U.S. Congress. It's bill number H.R. 127, and it specifically claims to provide for the licensing of firearms and ammunition possession and registration of firearms, and to prohibit the possession of certain ammunition. When we saw it, I was rather scandalized based on the education you've given us in the past on the intention of our founders and the duty of citizens within the Second Amendment and militia role and responsibility, and how this is really, what is this bill, where is it going to be going, and where is it taking us? Secondly, with silver so much in the news and in the public mindset recently, we wanted to get you to weigh in on a talk that you've done in the past on constitutional money and help to clarify the relationship specifically that silver was intended to have in all of our lives. So with that as context, could you kick us off with your view of where this bill, H.R. 127, about licensing and registration and taxation of firearms and ammunition, is likely to be headed, and what you think it means to the ordinary person?
I don't believe that this particular bill has a fairly good chance of coming, perhaps even out of committee, let alone passage. It looks to me like a stalking horse. They put forward an extreme piece of legislation, and then in order to get something enacted, they come back with a compromise. It's typical of the way the Democrats deal with gun control legislation. A piece of extreme legislation is laid on the table. The Republicans become aghast. The Democrats then say, well, let's compromise on something less extreme. And the Republicans, who are the arch appeasers, say, thank goodness that you offered that. We'll go with it. And gun control moves ahead another step. Now, this particular piece of legislation, of course, is directly aimed at two things. First, disarming as many people as possible by making the tax provision sufficiently onerous that an individual will be precluded, deterred, whatever word you want, from possessing a firearm or possessing more than one firearm. And then number two, the registration provisions are looking forward, obviously, to the day of confiscation. They want to know where the guns are, who has them, and so forth. This is actually not a new approach to gun control. There was a statute passed in 1934, which still exists, and it dealt with the taxation and registration of certain firearms, in particular machine guns, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, what so-called destructive devices, and then suppressors, or what commonly called silencers. and it imposed a $200 tax. Didn't outlaw those particular items, but it imposed a $200 tax on each transfer, so that if you wanted to purchase a machine gun from a dealer, you had to go through a background check, you had to pay a $200 tax stamp, and eventually you could have that firearm transferred to you, and of course registered to you. So all of those provisions were involved in that particular statute. Now, interestingly enough, some of the proponents of that statute wanted it to go beyond that, wanted it to go to, I think, handguns. They wanted to include all handguns in the statute, and that was beaten back. But we have it today in any event. This H.R. 127 increases the tax, increases the range of firearms that are going to be included, and of course adds this all-encompassing registration provision. The grave difficulty of this, if something like this were passed, is exactly how it would be effectively challenged in the court, because the imposition of the payment is a, quote, tax, unquote. And there's a statute called the Tax Injunction Act, which prevents a court from enjoining the collection of a tax initially. That is, you file a lawsuit and you can't ask for a preliminary injunction to enjoin the collection of the tax. You have to wait until the lawsuit comes to fruition. And generally what happens is people are required to pay the tax and then sue in the U.S. District Court, if we're talking about federal taxes, sue in the U.S. District Court as to the invalidity of that tax, and then the tax would be refunded.
Oh.
That's the sequence of events. So let's say that you had 10 guns, which is probably not a large number for many people in this country, and you had to pay an annual tax of $800 per gun. You're talking $8,000 right there. And the litigation is going to go potentially for several years, so you might have 8,000 times 1, times 2, times 3, perhaps times 4, and all that money would have to be paid out
in advance
until the litigation was successful in your favor. So you're looking at a situation where once they've passed this statute and made the tax onerous enough, it becomes extraordinarily difficult for people to fight it in the court system. You obviously can't get what's called a class action, because that really doesn't apply in this kind of situation. And so that's the one danger I see, that if you impose a significant tax on the transfer possession of a firearm, then you make the entry into litigation far more difficult. So you have a lot of people out there that are prepared to litigate against various kinds of gun control statutes, but many of them would not do that when they had to pay both the federal government and a lawyer for the privilege of doing the litigation. So it's problematic, and I can see why they would love to get that kind of a statute enacted. I just think that this one probably goes so far that it has, from a political point of view, not very much of a chance of succeeding. If it does, then we have a very serious problem, obviously.
Well, okay, so in a nutshell, in the past you've impressed upon us that the intention of the founders was that every able-bodied person, and it was written as men in the original constitutions of the colonies before they formed the United States of America, but had not only an obligation, had a duty to serve as a member of the state militia and to be outfitted and to keep in good working order and training and everything, a firearm that's suitable for the role of basically resisting foreign or domestic threats, which means the role of an infantryman. And here they're explicitly saying in here that anything that's a military-style weapon or military-style ammunition magazines and that sort of thing are all verboten under this or going to be registered and taxed. We've seen cases where people have been, quote-unquote, taxed off their land. People think they own their land, but they really don't hold the real title. That's just a memorandum title. The real title is held by the taxing authority in their county or whatever, and they can be taxed right off their land. And this sounds like a case where it can be a real burden, certainly at least infringing on or implying that there needs to be this registry where everyone, it sounds like before you have the seatbelt required law, you have the slippery slope that leads you that direction kind of thing. In this case, people having to be on this registry preparing for gun confiscation is one concern people have. The other is just being taxed out of being able to afford to possess it, or, as you say, have you go to fight that's even more expensive. Does it not fly in the face of the intention of and the duty of gun ownership on the part of ordinary citizens as laid out by the founders?
Well, it flies in the face of Congress's duty to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16. The structure of the Constitution with respect to the militia is there are these entities called the militia of the several states. The President is commander-in-chief of those. And Congress has the authority to provide for calling them forth for certain federal purposes, execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. And then Congress has a subsidiary power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining. And the word discipline really includes training of these structures. And then, because they are the militia of the several states, there's one in each of the states, they're state institutions, the states are supposed to do essentially the same thing. They're supposed to organize and train their militia, not only for these potential federal purposes, because Congress supposedly would provide for how that was to be done, but to deal with any particular state situations for which the militia was the appropriate response. That's what Virginia is a classic example. That's where I live. They have the militia of Virginia, includes everyone from 16 to 55, male and female, who's able-bodied, and then the statute goes on to deal with some circumstances, very few really, because it's a very watered-down thing now, whereby the governor can call up the so-called unorganized militia to perform certain kinds of functions relating basically to those three purposes: execute the laws, suppress insurrections, repel invasions, and they have some provisions for drug interdiction and so forth, some of these modern problems that they might have the militia handle as a law enforcement function. But one of those elements, of course, historically, the militia was to be and is to be armed. I don't know how you suppress large-scale insurrections or certainly repel invasions or in many circumstances execute the laws if you're not armed and trained for those purposes. And what kind of arms would one need for repelling invasions? Let's just take that as the ultimate problem. I would take it those would be the so-called weapons of war, something equivalent to what the invaders would have. The invaders would not be coming in with pop guns or pellet guns, right? They would have suitable weapons of war. Even the Chinese Women's Army has suitable weapons of war. So you look at these gun control bills, they're a direct attack. I mean, obviously a direct attack, not only on the Second Amendment concept of the right of the people to keep and bear arms sort of as individuals out there, and a direct attack on the militia, which are constitutional institutions. And you have to remember that the militia are not a bunch of people running around in the woods with camouflage outfits on their own. These are constitutional structures built into the federal system. The militia of the several states is one of the things that the President of the United States has the authority and the duty to command, all right? So these statutes are a direct attack on a fundamental part of the federal system that was put in there for the defense of the country. And let's just talk about defense of the country against foreign enemies. All right? Let's forget the rest of it, executing the laws, suppressing insurrections. Just focus on repelling invasions. So we're talking about foreign enemies. Well, tell me what would not give the enemies of this country more aid and comfort than to realize that that fundamental part of our federal defense system is being destroyed from within.
Yeah, you talk about defunding the police. This is disarming the militia.
All right. I mean, these people in Congress don't seem to realize the level at which they are operating. All right, in terms of unconstitutionality, the level of unconstitutionality, if there are levels, this one is essentially beyond the pale. But this is their long-term goal. They want to disarm the population so that it cannot perform that particular function, the militia function, domestically. I don't think they're necessarily thinking about the external problem, the international problem, the repelling invasions problem, although probably they don't care. Right? They're more worried about disarming the population in this country so that increasing what I would call police state or totalitarian state controls can be imposed on people. and there can't be a possibility of resistance. That's what they're really thinking about. And then they sell all of this on the basis of, oh, well, there are so many suicides with guns, we have to prevent, this is for the children, and so forth and so on. Which, when you look at the statistics, it's all nonsense. But this argument that's now become very fashionable, that they want to remove from the hands of the average people the so-called weapons of war, and they're talking about semi-automatic, magazine-fed rifles of one kind, AR-type rifles, AK-47 type rifles. And one would look at that and say, well, now, what kind of firearms are the members of the militia supposed to have? Well, they're supposed to be these weapons of war, equivalent in some sense to what the regular Army, Marine Corps, so forth, in this country would have. Well, that's what these statutes are directed towards. So they are direct, intentional violations of the Constitution. This is not a subject of debate. You can discuss this back and forth and ask, what's the mentality of these people who are doing it? But there's no debate about it. This is what they do, these statutes. They're a direct attempt to disarm the population in general. I'm not even going to talk about a segment of the population in general, and therefore to defeat part of the federal constitutional structure, because the concept of militia always was an armed population. If you had a disarmed population, by hypothesis, it couldn't possibly be a militia. You'd have to call it something else. So that's what they're going after. Now, I hardly think that most of these members of Congress have any idea of what they're doing. You know, this is what you would call objective unconstitutionality. They don't probably understand this. I think if you sat them down and said, explain to me the role of the militia in the constitutional structure, that they would be able to give one coherent sentence about that. They have no idea what they're talking about. But they have this idea, they do have the idea that you can't run a police state when you have the vast majority of the people armed. That's what they understand perfectly well. And so what their subjective motivation in this is, they want to be able to create the circumstances conducive to a police state. Well, you tell me what that entails, right? I mean, this is our problem. We have people in Congress, we have people in the state legislatures who have no conception of what the Constitution means and who are acting in a blatantly anti-constitutional fashion for some long-term goal, which I would imagine they would be somewhat embarrassed to have to explain to us. I mean, you tell me what the long-term goal is of removing this structure in the Constitution, which has, well, how should I put this? You can go back, you mentioned it, back into the colonial times, back to the earliest colonial acts of assemblies and so forth. Militias were set up in every one of the colonies, other than Pennsylvania initially, because Pennsylvania was run by the Quakers, who were, of course, conscientious objectors, pacifists. From the earliest days of the colonial system, from the charters, you'll find provisions in the charters that were granted by the king to his favorites to go off and start colonies that had the beginnings of the militia structure. And then it was run through the colonies, through the independent states, Articles of Confederation, U.S. Constitution. It's still here with us today. You'll find it in most of the, I can't say all because I haven't looked at all of them, but certainly all of the state statutory codes will have some provision dealing with militia. And all of that ties back to what people usually think about when this subject of gun control comes up, the Second Amendment. Right? And the Second Amendment begins how? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Then the right of the people to keep their arms shall not be infringed. Well, those first 13 words are the key to the whole business. What's the goal? A free state. What's necessary to its security? A well-regulated militia. I mean, there's the statement right there. So to the extent that you undercut a well-regulated militia by undercutting or removing or watering down or whatever the right of the people to keep arms sufficient for functioning in a militia, you remove what is necessary for the security of a free state, and therefore you endanger a free state. Now, that doesn't really take more than, a middle school education to be able to read that sentence?
Yeah.
And figure out what it's supposed to say? And, of course, the Second Amendment is not there by itself. It's there in conjunction with the provisions of the original Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 15, 16, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 is the presidential authority. They're all tied together. And it just amazes me that someone would sit down and write one of these gun control statutes, especially this particular one, because it's pretty draconian. And there wasn't someone on the staff that would have said, we have a constitutional problem here. Yeah. Maybe we can't go to this extreme. Maybe there's some other way we want to do this. If we're really concerned about keeping certain kinds of firearms out of the hands of the criminal element, right? And that's where the joke comes in, because these statutes are never aimed really at the criminal element. The criminals don't have to obey a registration statute. That was determined by the Supreme Court long ago, the famous Haynes case. It said, a registration statute cannot be applied to a criminal, because if the criminal registered the gun, he would be incriminating himself because he didn't have the right to have the gun. All right? It was a Fifth Amendment problem. You couldn't require a criminal to register an illegal gun, a gun that he couldn't possess because he was a felon, whatever the reason was, right? That's Haynes versus United States. So if you look at these statutes about registration, what the heck are they talking about?
Oh my.
They're certainly not going to keep guns out of the hands of the criminal element. The criminals are not going to register these guns. The criminals are not going to pay the tax. So it's a joke. It's aimed at the average individual, and it's aimed ultimately not simply at the average individual, but at these constitutional structures called the militia of the several states. And ultimately, in the final analysis, what is it going to do? Well, internationally, if you will, it's going to weaken the ability of the United States to defend itself. And then domestically, it's going to lead to a situation that will encourage further and further advances of a totalitarian nature in various government elements. So, I look at this and I say, this has been going on for a long time, 1934, 1968 series, and then there was the gun control statute, 1996, the Clinton gun ban, that had a sunshine period in it, so it lasted only 10 years. We've seen all sorts of proposals since then, certainly at the state level. Maryland passed one several years ago, severely limiting the ability of the average citizen to get his hands on one of those so-called weapons of war. Virginia, it was introduced here, but then it kind of dropped off the radar because there was a tremendous amount of public antipathy towards it. It'll be brought back. That same type of statute will be brought back. And they all follow the same pattern. They either outlaw entirely the possession of those undesirable firearms, or they allow for possession of the firearms that already are in private hands, not new ones, but the ones who are already in private hands, but you have to register them. I mean, that combination is always there. And this House 127, this just adds the fillip of the very large tax payment. I say that's the one that's, from a procedural point of view, is the dangerous one. These other kinds of statutes, you can challenge them, and you could make an argument for a preliminary injunction, especially if the statute is saying, well, you can't possess this kind of a firearm. Someone comes along and says, well, I possess one, and I want to have a preliminary injunction so that I don't have to dispossess myself of it until it's determined whether the statute's constitutional or not. With respect to the tax, you run into the Anti-Injunction Act, and you have to pay the tax and then sue for the refund or sue on the basis of the unconstitutionality of the statute. So it makes it a little more difficult, and I'm sure that that's one of the reasons that whoever drafted that statute had in mind as a practical value to approaching it from that standpoint. You notice that the 1934 statute didn't really stop anyone from acquiring the short barrel rifle, shotguns, machine guns, and so forth and so on. It just put on the $200 tax, a one-time $200 tax, not an annual tax, a one-time tax. And then the background check had to be sure that the person who was going to be the transferee didn't have some kind of criminal record. But that statute's been here since 1934, and it really has not interfered significantly with people who wanted those kinds of firearms, except now there was a statute passed, I can't remember, it may have been in the 1990s, that prohibited the further production of those firearms. So if you want a machine gun, they're extraordinarily expensive, not because of the tax, but simply because the market has dried up and new production isn't there. This thing is designed to do it, I think, in the other way, in the other direction. It's designed to impose such a tax burden on people who already possess those firearms that they're going to have to get rid of them, going to have to sell them. Imagine you had a 20 gun collection.
Yeah.
Okay, 20 times 800 is what?
$16,000.
Yeah. $16,000 a year to maintain that collection. That might be more than the value of the firearms, if they were some of the very common 22 type firearms. They wouldn't have each one of those would maybe not have that value, and that's each year, right? So it might be the first year would be fine, but then it's the second year, third year, fourth year, and so that's the goal. Put this huge burden on the possession of what you have, and then also make it difficult for the person who wants to purchase a new firearm, because there's the $800 tax. And of course, why is $800 a limit?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, it was $200 in 1934. Now it's $800. Why couldn't it be made $1,000, $2,000, whatever they want? Mm-hmm. And this brings you back to the famous statement. I think it's McCulloch versus Maryland. The power to tax involves the power to destroy. Right? That was the whole point of that case. That Maryland put a tax on the Bank of the United States, and the Supreme Court said, well, this is instrumentality of the United States, and if you can tax them for $1, you can tax them for as high as you want. You can essentially destroy their function. And we can't have that, because it's the instrumentality of the United States. It's very interesting. That was the argument. The Bank of the United States was not part of the government. It was simply being used by the government for certain functions, banking functions, right? And Maryland put a tax on, I think it was on its property, not on its banking functions. And the Supreme Court said, Chief Justice Marshall, a famous statement, power to tax involves the power to destroy. If you can tax this thing for $1, you can tax it to the point at which it's driven out of business. And it is performing a function of the national government, so you are effectively taxing the national government. Well, what are the militia of the several states? That's part of the federal structure. How can you impose a tax on that if you couldn't impose a tax on the Bank of the United States? Well, you explain that one to me. See, it just works the opposite. The Bank of the United States was an instrumentality of the federal government. Mm-hmm. The militia of the several states are part of the state governments, right? Just as Congress could not impose a tax on the legislature of Virginia, or the members of the legislature of Virginia, they have to pay $1,000 every session of the legislature to which they attend, right? It can't impose a tax on the members of the militia of Virginia. Also, the militia of Virginia have this responsibility to the federal government. So the tax on the militia of Virginia would be undermining Congress's duty to maintain these institutions to perform these functions of the federal government. This is an absurdity. But the problem we have in this country, the practical problem is, the average person doesn't understand how this system works. He looks at the gun control problem as affecting individuals in their acquisition or possession of firearms. We're worried about Joe Dokes. Well, ultimately, we're not worried about Joe Dokes. We're worried about these institutions of which Joe Dokes is a part, in fact, a compulsory member, and the role of those institutions in the Federalist system, state and national levels, and the limitations on the legislatures at those two levels to interfere with this structure. Right? So the state legislatures can't undermine the militia of their own states. Why? Because that would prevent Congress from using those institutions effectively. So it would be an attack on Congress for a state legislature to pass some kind of statute like this against its own citizens. On the other hand, it's a violation for Congress to do it because that's undermining these state institutions. This is the federal system. Right? As long as you look at it from the point of view of the individual, you don't understand that. As long as you look at it from the point of view of the militia structure, you get a completely different picture. So these people in Congress are following along the line of what's called the individual right to keep and bear arms. That's what people like the NRA and many of these pro-Second Amendment groups are focusing on. The right of an individual as an individual to have a firearm at all, or a certain kind of firearm, or a certain kind of ammunition, whatever it may be. Whereas the constitutional way to look at this is that gun control is attacking this federal structure. It's attacking these federal institutions, either at the national level, where Congress has the duty to arm, or at the state level, because the institutions are actual state establishments, just like the state legislature. Now, as long as people don't recognize that that's the real problem, gun control is simply going to advance, maybe not as far as this particular bill would like it to in one jump, but it's going to go on with the death of 1,000 cuts. A little bit here and move a little bit further on, a little bit further on. Eventually you'll get to the type of provision we're talking about, somewhere down the line. So I think that's the major problem here. It's that the people in Congress and state legislatures and the gun rights people, all of them, gun control people and the gun rights people, are all operating on the same faulty constitutional theory. They're looking at this from the point of view of, can the legislature limit an individual's right in this area, individual's right with respect to firearms and ammunition and training? I mean, you can add a lot of other things that are connected to the militia. And the short answer is, well, yes, they can pass statutes that make armed robbery or assault with a deadly weapon illegal and punish those criminally, bank robbery, whatever. That's no problem. Right? So you have the individual use of firearms can be controlled in one way or another. But when we're talking about the individual's ultimate right/duty to possess firearms, to be trained with firearms, the answer is no. There's a minimum level beyond which, or I said maximum level, I guess is a better way to put it. It's a maximum level beyond which the legislatures, both at the national level and at the state level, cannot go. And you see this, I mean, the Virginia Constitution is even more explicit than the Second Amendment. It says a well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people trained to arms, is the proper, necessary, and safe defense of a free state. Therefore, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay? So it tells you it defines it right there. Of course, at that time, who were the leading statesmen in Virginia? Madison, Monroe, Henry, Jackson, Jefferson, and so forth, and so on. I mean, you're talking about the towering figures among the founding fathers. But they make it very clear, and this is from the original Virginia Constitution, the well-regulated militia being composed of the body of the people trained to arms. Well, what's the body of the people? That's basically everybody. And in Virginia, they say 16 to 55. And then trained to arms. Well, okay, trained to arms for what purpose? For serving in this thing called a militia. And what kind of arms would those be? Well, they would be the arms that were suitable for that kind of service, right? And what would be the ultimate purpose? Well, maintaining this thing called a free state. Pretty simple.
Yeah.
Now, you lay that template on any one of these gun control statutes, and it doesn't work.
No.
They don't fit. And as I said before, I think it's primarily because these legislators really have never kind of stepped back and taken the broader perspective and saying, well, wait a minute, what are we actually trying to do here? What's the consequence of what we're accomplishing? And unfortunately, that's also what the gun rights people have done.
Yep.
Right? They have focused on this thing from the point of view of Joe Dokes and his right to have a gun, as opposed to Joe Dokes as part of this institutional structure built into the Constitution in which his having a gun and being trained to arms with that gun is a duty of his, not simply a right. And as a result of that, I think combine these two things, in the long run, the gun control people will certainly win if the perspective isn't changed, because one of the principles that the Supreme Court has written into the law, created, is this concept of the compelling state interest. And they've applied this to the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, You can find it all over the place. And the basic concept is, if the government has a compelling state interest to regulate a protected right, that regulation is constitutional. Well, who determines what a compelling state interest is? Well, ultimately, it's the Supreme Court. But kind of down the ladder, it would be the legislature. They pass the statute to begin with. Congress passes the statute. State legislature passes the statute. Works its way up to the judiciary, and the judiciary finally says what a compelling state interest is. Well, what that amounts to is a license in the government to determine when it may violate the Constitution.
Right.
All right? And it's always directed at individuals. I've never seen a case where the Supreme Court has even suggested that there could be a compelling state interest in Congress passing legislation that would infringe upon, whatever, abridge, whatever word you want, the action of something like a state legislature or something like a state governor within his area of authority, because we have a federal system. But with respect to the individual, no problem. So as long as you continue, not you, the proponents of the Second Amendment, continue on this individual right tack, they will discover that there will always be found, in the long run, a compelling state interest for whatever the legislatures and the courts want to do. That's what I find amazing. How could you possibly have a compelling state interest? What could be the compelling state interest in undermining a free state?
Right.
Well, the answer is none. It's impossible. Well, here's something that the Constitution itself, Second Amendment, says is necessary to the security of a free state. Could there be a compelling state interest in undermining that? No. What is that? It's a militia. Well, there's no compelling state interest in undermining the structure of a militia. And what is a militia? It's where the body of the people is armed and trained to arms. So if you follow this thing through, you see what we consider gun control today, with the typical language that's used, is fundamentally unconstitutional. There can be no justification for it. If people act irresponsibly with firearms, then you deal with that in a separate set of statutory prohibitions and penalties, right? Which all exist, by the way. I don't know of any place in the country where people can use firearms in a irresponsible criminal fashion where there isn't some kind of legislative control, penalty, punishment, and so forth already on the books. So you ask the question, what is this all about? Well, it goes back to the point I made earlier. There are some people who really understand. I think the people ultimately behind this type of legislation really understand that you can't have the kind of country they want to have if the average person is armed. And that's why they don't talk about the militia. Let me just focus and end with that. That's also why they never put it in that context. Because they don't want the average person that they're going after to realize, wait a minute, what's the big picture here? What is the real threat that I as an individual face by these proposed gun control statutes? Well, ultimately, it's not just myself not being able to possess a particular kind of firearm or being burdened by registration or being burdened by taxation. It's my inability to live in a free state.
Right.
Maybe not today. Maybe it'll be tomorrow. Maybe it won't be this group of legislators who have enacted these gun control provisions who will be the ones who also will enact the totalitarian laws of a police state. It'll be 2 or 3 sessions in the future of Congress when this happens. But this is the way these systems inevitably break down. Right? They remove one protection after the other, and eventually you find yourself with no protection at all. I used to have maybe I told you this, I used to have a professor that had a little quip. He said, life is like a slice of bologna, and time is like a knife. And every day you cut off a piece of that bologna and you consume it. And no matter how thin you slice it, the day will eventually arise when you are out of time and full of bologna. Okay? And that's exactly what's happening here, the so-called salami slicing tactics. You cut off a little bit of the protection of the Second Amendment and the militia provisions of the original Constitution, and you do this sequentially, a little bit here, a little bit there, and eventually you'll get to the point where you do not have the ability of the average person to function in the militia which is necessary to the security of a free state. See? They can't come at it directly and say, well, we're going to remove this whole concept. That would be too blatant. They do it in the opposite, from the opposite direction, is make it increasingly difficult and eventually impossible for the average person, the person who was the average member of the militia, to function in that capacity. Because either he doesn't have the firearm at all, or maybe he can have some firearms, but not the ones that are really suitable for that purpose, or he doesn't have the ammunition, he can't get the training, whatever it is that he would need, or the firearms are all registered in such a way they could be confiscated, or all these other types of control. I mean, the statutes, I can remember statutes all going back to the 1960s where they were proposing that people could have their guns only in a gun club, and they had to be locked up. And when you came to the gun club, you had to sign out for the gun, you had to sign out for so many cartridges, and you went target shooting or skeet shooting, whatever it was that you did, and then you had to bring the gun back with the empty cartridge cases. All right? So you could never accumulate any ammunition outside of this controlled environment. So those are the kinds of really extraordinarily unconstitutional statutes that were being proposed way back then, talking about the early 60s, saw them. They're probably waiting in the wings somewhere. Right.
Wow.
At some stage, somebody will say, yes, I think we've got enough political support to put this thing through, or at least to propose it. And it all aims at the same point, getting the firearms out of the control of the average individual so the average individual cannot perform this function. And I'm not even talking about what a lot of Second Amendment people say, oh, you have to defend against tyranny. I'm talking about a situation you have a major breakdown in the economy, right? So we have a social chaos going on. Do you really think, and I guess we've seen this in the riots that occurred last year, do you really think that the police that we now have would be capable of dealing with this? And the answer is, well, they weren't capable of dealing with those riots in those cities.
Yeah.
What would it be like if we had a major economic breakdown so that it spread outside of the urban areas, into the suburban areas, and maybe into some of the rural areas? There simply are not enough people to deal with that major duty of executing the laws. That's why you have that provision in the Constitution. Because situations could arise that would be so extreme that you would need to mobilize large numbers of the people to be able to execute the laws and provide the necessary defense for the maintenance of the free state structure. And who would fill that in once the militia removed? Well, if you really wanted to accomplish it, you'd have to increase multifold the police structures. And you go to what kind of a state? Well, it's not a free state. It's a police state. Right? And then the next level is the totalitarian state. I don't really get beyond that. That's the ultimate, right? But those are the three in my mind. The free state, where the people are the ultimate elements of control. And then you go to the police state, in which the people don't perform that function, but this professional group of myrmidons does. And then you go to the totalitarian state, where everything is controlled by an elite group through military and secret police, as they call them, secret police force. And so that's what we're looking at, and that I just become a little bit frustrated that the Second Amendment people, pro-Second Amendment people, just can't catch on to the significance of this. It is not about Joe Dokes and his gun. It's about the free state and the guns of all the people that would be necessary to provide security there. And as I've said to some people more recently, I say, this is not about, the Second Amendment is not about saving your miserable life. Why? Because if you're called up in the militia, under any of those three circumstances, executing the laws, certainly suppressing insurrections, and certainly repelling invasions, you might have to give up your life. If you're called out in the militia to repel an invasion, you think it might be likely that you could be killed? I would think so, right? And that's your duty as a citizen. So the Second Amendment is not looking necessarily to protecting your life. It's looking to you performing some function to protect your society. Now, it may be that at a very low level, yes, you would be protecting the gun that you had at home, or the guns that you had at home would be used to protect your life against the adventitious criminal. But that's not the purpose of the system. It's kind of an adjunct of the system. It's a necessary consequence simply of having people trained and armed. But the real purpose of the system is to maintain the state against these kinds of dangers, external and internal. And until the Second Amendment people realize that, until they start making the argument on that basis, they're going to continue to lose in this gun control because it will advance, what's the expression, on little cat's feet, like the fog on little cat's feet.
Yeah.
Right, slowly and silently, maybe not so silently, but slowly, it's moving ahead. And that's why I look at the Sheila Jackson Lee piece of legislation. I say, well, there's really nothing new under the sun. That's proposing approaches that were enacted into law in 1934, and it's moving in the direction that they have been, the gun control people have been proposing forever, as far as I can remember, registration. Right? And registration is always ultimately connected with the possibility, at least, of confiscation.
Yes.
And what would be the purpose of confiscating guns from the people who form the institution that's necessary to the security of the free state? I mean, just think about that. What would be the purpose of that? Could that possibly advance the security of a free state?
That's
this is really simple. I mean,
yeah.
We're talking about this is kindergarten-level constitutional law.
Well,
It's
unfortunately, I think those arguments are often lost on our populace because we've been so effectively conditioned to accept this, basically a redirection of a shift of the conversation away from a free society to say we're going to give you a safe. You asked quite a bit earlier, a rhetorical question about what would be the purpose of anyone trying to enact legislation like this, and I think that the stated purpose that we are fed is that this is going to increase our safety. This is for your own good. This is for your safety. See, it's going to prevent situations like this bad thing that happened. And it's even named. I even have a name in here. It says this is going to be titled, this act may be cited as the Sabika Sheikh Firearm Licensing and Registration Act. We have these bills that are titled after poster characters that were affected by this in some way that have seized the populace's, the popular attention of people. And so we're sold this idea that we need to be, that our government is there to keep us safe rather than our government is there to assure that we don't lose our freedoms. Is that not the case?
Well, yes, but remember, the militia is part of the government.
Right.
See, once again, the Second Amendment people look at this from the point of view of, here's an individual and he's somehow distinct from the government. And as I say, and then that exposes him to the compelling state interest contention that his rights can be limited by this thing called the government, right? But the reality of it is that whole Second Amendment complex of ideas, not just in the Second Amendment, but in the Constitution itself, is based upon the concept that it's the people themselves in the militia that are part of the government. These things are called the militia of the several states. They are not kind of independent groups of disconnected individuals roaming around on their own. They're as much of a part of the government of Virginia, for instance, as the legislature and the governor is of the judicial system. In fact, they're more important than any of those because in the Virginia laws, as well as the U.S. Constitution, it never says that the legislature, the governor, or the judiciary is necessary to the security of a free state. Find me that statement. It never says that. The only institutions that in which that connection is made are the militia of the several states, or in Virginia, it's the well-regulated militia of Virginia, right? The proper, necessary, and security of a free state. Okay? Nowhere else. So we understand, I think if you work through American political history and American political science, contribution that Americans made to political science, the recognition has always been, well, wait a minute, those institutions called the government, which we think of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, those things can go awry. We can have the wrong people there. We can have public officials who are working against the interest of the public. That's historically true throughout history, all history, right? But you fall back on the fact, well, the people aren't going to do that. The people themselves are not going to work against their own interests. Oh, and we have given them the ultimate authority. It's this thing called the militia, or these things called the militia, the armed people. They are not going to be so corrupted that they would work against their own interests and allow tyrants to destroy a free state. That's the thinking here. And obviously, in a free state, who has to have the ultimate political power? Well, it's got to be the people, right? What is a free state but a state that caters to and is controlled by the people themselves in their own interest? So that, obviously, it all works together in the federal system. Yes, we have the Congress, we have the executive, the president, we have the judiciary, same thing at the state level. And we have this other branch over here called the militia of the several states, the 50 of them, and they can be used for these vitally important purposes. Just stop at the first one, execute the laws. Right? Power to execute the laws of the Union, or at the state level, execute the laws of the state. Well, now, what is government other than the executor of the laws? Right? It's the institution that executes the laws, right? And so you see, in the Constitution of the United States, what is the only institution that is explicitly given the power to execute the laws? Well, it's the militia. So there are these two provisions. Congress has the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, because we're talking about the federal level. And the President of the United States, who is the commander-in-chief of the militia, when called into the actual service of the United States, he, of course, has the duty at all times to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So it's fascinating. When you look at the Constitution of the United States, the guy who has the personal duty at all times to take care that the laws be faithfully executed is also the guy who is the commander-in-chief of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States, and that actual service could include executing the laws of the Union. Now, was this thing drafted in a coherent fashion or not?
Yes.
Obviously it was. They had a picture in mind which is very, very easy to see. So here we have these institutions, these state institutions. They can become subject to the President of the United States when they're called forth to execute the laws of the Union, and of course he would be performing his duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, what is a higher level of government than that? What does government do of consequence beyond executing the laws? Isn't that the reason that you have it? Why would we need a government if we didn't need to execute laws? Or we had some other way to execute laws? So, this is not something that requires a Harvard Law School education. In fact, a Harvard Law School education these days, I think, would undermine your understanding of this. All you have to do is read the Constitution and put yourself into the position of the people who essentially ratified it. I mean, the average person at the time. The average person at the time, males at least, because of the social situation they had, was a member or had been a member of one of these institutions. 13 of them at the time, right? 13 original states.
Right.
He was a member, or he had been a member. Maybe he's too old now. Maybe he's no longer able-bodied, whatever. But he had been a member of the militia of some state. He knew perfectly well what this was because he performed this function. Now, our difficulty today is the average person has never performed this function. And he's probably never read state statutes that deal with the militia.
Right.
He's probably never read the Constitution and thought through how the Second Amendment relates to these provisions in the original Constitution. In fact, I have discussions with people all the time here in Virginia, raising the point of the militia, and they look at me askance. And then I say, well, how old are you? And they say, I'm 37 years old, whatever. I say, are you able-bodied? You're a citizen of the United States? Yes, I am. I said, well, do you realize that you're a member of a militia? And he looks at me, what militia? The militia of Virginia. Do you realize that the governor can call you out at any time for these functions? Don't you understand this? Have you never looked?
No, that's actually part of the dismantling. You mentioned the dismantling piece by piece by piece. I think that was one of the earlier pieces that was dismantling, was the common people's understanding and experience in participating in that.
Yeah, but it's amazing because in this particular case, it's right there in the statute book.
Yes.
Right. It's not that they've removed it somehow from the statute book. Probably in some states it's pretty obscure. But in Virginia, it just kind of slaps you in the face when you open the book. And the problem goes back to education.
Yes.
At the lowest level. One would think that militia statute says you become a member of the militia at 16 years of age.
You better teach it in eighth grade civics class then, yeah.
Going back to about 12 years of age, okay. I would think at least.
Yeah.
Because you want to start off with the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. What is the foundation of our government? Because it's the foundation of the government that leads you to this next point, which is, well, how do we preserve this? All right? If the people have this kind of authority, and we've written this into the Constitution, how does the Constitution preserve this? Oh, it does this through this thing called the militia. And that's why you, Jimmy, and you, Sally, in 2 or 3 years, are going to be subject to this statute, Virginia Code 44-1. Right? And you're going to have to do this and this and this over the next several years, because you are part of this much bigger structure, and you are a key component in the defense of our free state here in Virginia, the defense of our free state on a national level. That's what we're talking about. You're a very important component in this. You are the ultimate defense. You and the other members of the class here. We're all going to be members of the ultimate defense. And that's what should be taught. Now, if that were taught, all sorts of other problems would also disappear. All right? Because now people would realize, well, wait a minute, the average politician that I'm dealing with, local, state, or national, he is really something that is subordinate to this much bigger picture. He can't tell me ultimately what to do. He has to respond to me, not the other way around. Yeah, it creates a completely different mindset. And that's why they removed it. You see, you think of gun control as the most obvious way they're trying to remove this, because they want to get the implements away from people. But they want to take away, they've been very, very, very successful in taking away the implements in your mind. All right? You can't think this through because you don't have a foundation. You have no historical foundation. You have no legal foundation. You have no political foundation. It's all been removed. And where do you find that happening? Well, it's all in the secondary, middle school, below middle school, I guess. What does middle school include? Is it 12 years old, 13 years old?
Yep.
Right? And then the high schools, of course. And then the colleges. By the time you get to college, after being through an American high school, you're already a semi-Marxist. You know, cultural Marxism is there. They're already feeding you gun control. What do they have in every school without exception? The little boy points his finger like a gun. The little boy bites his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun.
Yeah.
And so forth, okay? And something draconian happens to him. He's penalized in some way, all right? Why? Why is that being taught as opposed to the other thing, which would be, number one, the political structure, but number two, firearm safety? We have huge amounts of firearms in this country. And people are worried about, they're going to be used incorrectly. Well, they're going to be used incorrectly in the sense that they're going to be used unsafely, so let's teach safety.
Right. They're
going to be used incorrectly in the sense that they may be used in criminal endeavors, so let's educate people about that. Let's educate people about the law. I mean, I teach courses, firearms instructor, personal protection courses. And one of the main parts of those courses is the law.
Yes.
Firearms law.
Yes, that's true.
All right? So why? Now, obviously, people have to come to those courses. They're not mandatory in the schools. But why hasn't that been taught? If people were paying attention to the Constitution, and if people were paying attention to that part of the Constitution which is necessary to the security of a free state, and this would be taught in the schools, I would think that a very, very large percentage of all the legitimate arguments for gun control, such as people are acting unsafely with guns, people are doing things with guns that verge on criminal behavior, threatening other people with guns, that would disappear. But it isn't being taught, because if you taught that, then you'd have to teach the other side of that coin. You see? This all fits together.
Wow. It never ceases to amaze me how much more there is to this issue of gun control than just self-defense or hunting rights. You've always broadened and deepened our appreciation of the fundamental aspects of that are rooted in the founding of our country and the rights as free people. We'd also like to turn our attention to the foundational and constitutional roots of our money and the relationship of honest money to freedom and how we've lost it and how we need to get back to it. So if you could talk to us about the role that silver has been playing in the history of freedom in our country and what's been changing. Some recent events have really drawn public attention to the role of silver and the lack of transparency around the marketplace where silver prices are set silver physical availability is managed, and could you talk to us about why that's important for us to understand right now?
The silver thing is interesting because, once again, you go back to the Constitution. There's the word dollar in the Constitution, so-called slave tax clause, so many dollars for each person imported into the country. And then there's a Seventh Amendment, which refers to the dollar amount that's necessary for a jury trial in civil cases. And you look at that and you say, well, that's interesting. What does that word mean? I mean, they picked this out and said dollar. This was a unit of money. What was that supposed to be? And the answer is, if you go back historically, it was a Spanish coin called the Spanish mill dollar, which was designated by Queen Anne in a proclamation and then by a statute back in the early 1700s to be the unit of account in the colonies for all foreign coinage. Because, of course, the big unit of account in the British Empire was the pound sterling. Right? So, in the colonial history, the Spanish mill dollar was the key monetary unit. And primarily because there was a lot of trade with the West Indies, the Caribbean, and so forth, which was Spanish, under Spanish control. And a lot of that coinage came out of the mints of Peru and Mexico in particular. And that was the unit of account, basically, in the colonies. So when independence came along, the question was, well, we're not going to use the British monetary system. What are we going to use? And the Spanish mill dollar was chosen because it was the one that was being used. These were very practical people. And after the Constitution was, actually the Articles of Confederation, they tried to determine what the value of a Spanish mill dollar was, value being how much silver did it contain, because they came from different mints and they were less than pristine.
Yep, some were worn, yeah.
So that kind of a problem arose. And so they came up with a calculation under the Articles of Confederation. And then under the Constitution, they did it again. Jefferson and Hamilton, one of the rare areas in which they both agreed, they did it again. And they came up with a figure of 371.25 grains of pure silver in a Spanish mill dollar. And this is embodied in the Mint Act of 1792, the unit of currency in the United States. The definition of that dollar word in the Constitution is 371.25 grains, as a result of an historical determination. This wasn't some arbitrary number they came up with. They actually got a bunch of merchants together, and these people collected typical Spanish mill dollars and did a chemical assay and came up with an average amount of silver. And so that became the unit, the constitutional unit. So theoretically, constitutionally, if you will, the unit of money in this country is the dollar, the silver dollar containing 371.25 grains of pure silver plus whatever base metals are necessary to make a good coin. So that's the unit. Now, of course, we don't operate on that unit. You can get your hands on these American Liberty silver coins, and those are an ounce of silver, so they're not really a constitutional dollar, although they're called a dollar.
Yeah.
And then you can find the older silver coins, the pre-Kennedy, pre-64 ones, the Morgan silver dollar being kind of a classic example, of the Walking Liberty silver dollar being another one. They have the right amount of silver in them. And then there's this subsidiary silver coinage, which had, 45% of the true value. But the principle is still there. So you say, all right, could we bring back, let's talk theoretically, could we bring back silver into our monetary system? And the answer is, well, not only could we, but we should, because it's the constitutional standard. And it has all sorts of economic value as well, because it can't be manipulated, politically manipulated. How do we do it? And the answer is, well, coinage is a little bit cumbersome. Always was cumbersome. And you would never have a complete system of coinage. They never did. So you had token coins, or banknotes, and checks, and so forth, and so on. The base metallic coins being a classic example of a token coin, the cent, the nickel, all right, to make change. Well, today we have advanced because we have the electronic system. We can take a lump of silver, a bar of silver, and we can divide it electronically into as small units as we want. All right, take 371.25 grains being a dollar, we can divide that bar of silver, whatever weight it is, into so many dollars, so many quarter dollars, half dollars, hundredths of a dollar, thousandths of a dollar, 10,000ths of a dollar, 100,000ths of a dollar. Computer doesn't care how many zeros you put to the right of the decimal point, right? Put as many as you want. So we have the ability now to make, as it were, infinite change on a single piece of silver, doing it electronically. And so that silver would never actually leave the vault unless somebody wanted to take it away. Some kind of paranoid individual who's afraid of the security. It would never leave the vault. Transfers would all be made electronically. You would have no problem whatsoever with making change. So actually now, it's interesting, now at this point in time, we finally have to make a specie money system really work. Because in the past, the specie money system eventually fell back on coins of fixed sizes, and there were only so many different types of coinage. And also we can do the exchange rate between gold and silver, because in the first Coinage Act, 1792, the dollar is a silver coin, and then there were gold coins. They weren't called dollars. They were called eagles. For the reason that they weren't dollars, they had to have another name. And their value was determined in relation to silver by the market exchange rate at the time. I remember this was the so-called bimetallic system. So over a period of time, it was 14 to 1, 15 to 1, 16 to 1, whatever it was. And they picked the one that was contemporary at the time. And that was the great difficulty, because obviously that ratio changes. And it changed by 1830, in the 1830s, end of the 1820s, early 1830s. They had another statute in 1834. So they had to keep going back in to change the value of the gold coinage relative to silver, because the eagles had a certain dollar denomination that were given to them. And that dollar denomination was tied to this market exchange ratio between silver and gold, and the market exchange ratio between silver and gold was constantly changing. So this was the problem, and that's why you had historically the controversy between the bimetallic people and then the monometallic people. The monometallic people, some of them were for silver and some of them were for gold, and you have the fight that eventually takes place after the Civil War. Are we going to have a silver standard? Silver going to continue to be the standard, the famous gold standard bill of 1900, etc. All right. Well, we don't have that problem anymore, because the ratio can be determined instantaneously for each transaction. So you can have the bimetallic system, silver and gold, which was the original constitutional system, with silver as the unit, because we can calculate instantaneously what the gold-silver ratio is.
Right.
All right? So now this is the first time in world history that we can actually make this system work the way it was intended to work. It was not intended to cheat people originally.
Right.
Right? It was intended, if you paid in gold, you were going to pay, theoretically, the same value as if you paid in silver.
Right.
The difficulty was that this number in between, this bimetallic ratio, market ratio, was not a fixed number, and it could not easily be calculated. So they couldn't do what we do today. They didn't have the ability to make those calculations, especially in outlying. If you weren't in Philadelphia or New York or Boston or someplace, you couldn't make the calculations in an outlying area. Today we're able to do it. So if someone wanted to come back in Congress and say, let's go back to a sound constitutional monetary system, the answer is yes, we can absolutely do it. And I'll tell you that I wrote a bill for New Hampshire, and I wrote a bill for Montana that did it.
Okay.
They set up a depository, and the depository was going to contain gold and silver, and the state would deal electronically with collection of taxes on the one hand and payment to state creditors on the other hand. And the whole thing was going to be run on that basis. Now, if people wanted to take their gold and silver out of the depository, that was their own business. But theoretically, it could have been left there indefinitely. Difficulty was politics. In New Hampshire, for some reason, the bill, it happened twice, the bill was sent to a Commerce Committee, although it was really a finance bill, because it dealt with taxation. And the head of the Commerce Committee at the time was this guy was very antagonistic to what we were trying to do. So he put every kind of roadblock he could in the way, and nothing came out of it. Now, Montana, same type of bill. First time it was put in, there was a split, 50-50 split on the committee that handled it between the Republicans and Democrats. And they voted party line. So the bill didn't get out of committee because it had no majority. Politics again, all right? The second time it came up in Montana, the Republicans had gained control of the House of Representatives, so the bill came out of the committee, and it went to the floor of the House, and it lost because all the Democrats were against it, and some of the so-called rhinos lined up with the Democrats. And it lost by about 3 or 4 votes. It was close, but nonetheless, it lost. I don't know. That thing has been circulating around, and I haven't seen anybody else use it. What was interesting about that was in New Hampshire, we had a long talk with the treasurer about the practicality of it. He said, "Oh yeah, well, I can do this. No, there's absolutely no problem. All I would need to do is put in some new software to handle it. No difficulty." So it wasn't a practical problem. It was a political problem, and I imagine it was a political problem in the sense of someone, they were getting calls from the bankers or whatever, saying, "Don't put this thing in. We don't want this." Now, Texas is an interesting example because Texas did set up and has set up a depository for gold and silver. And as I understand it, the goal there is to allow people to use this depository as a kind of bank where they could transfer their ownership interest in the gold and silver to other people back and forth, and actually make payments in commercial transactions, for instance.
Right.
So a couple of years now, I wrote a bill, and actually we did it twice, once again. It happened twice, to deal with that question in terms of making the gold clause contracts fully enforceable in Texas. Because that's one of the problems you have. What happens when a person makes a contract payable in so many dollars in gold or payable in so many dollars in silver?
Yeah.
Are those dollar contracts or are those somehow commodity contracts, even though it's a dollar's worth of silver, constitutional dollar's worth of silver? What is it, right? And how is it to be enforced? If you have a gold or silver clause contract, you go into court because there's a breach of contract, and the court's going to give you damages, monetary damages, because of that breach. Do those monetary damages have to be paid in gold or silver, or could they be paid in paper money? That's another question, right? So the bill was designed to get around to solve all those questions in favor of gold and silver contracts, so that the depository would now become a very practical means for people to engage in these kinds of transactions. The gold and silver would be there. It'd be subject to electronic transfer. You'd have a very clear picture of how the courts, in Texas at least, had to handle these kinds of transactions so that there would be complete protection on the gold and silver side of the transaction. You wouldn't find yourself in a situation down the line where you thought you had a gold clause contract, but you came into some court and a judge says, "Oh no, this thing can be paid in paper money." Right? So that was all. That went too. That never got beyond the kind of the drawing board stage. Notwithstanding that everything had been written in a way that was, as I understand it, was satisfactory to there's some kind of committee of the legislature that looks at these things. Professionals will look at and say whether the statute fits the mold, is properly structured and so forth, not a technical thing. So there was nothing wrong with the statute on that basis, but for one reason or another, it didn't get to the point where it was being considered. And I always found that one extremely strange because they already had the depository. See, in the New Hampshire statute and the Montana statute that I drafted, they had to create a depository.
Yes.
That was the first thing. The statute says you have to create a depository, these kinds of limits and controls and accounting structures and so forth, and then it can be used this way. But the Texas people already had their depository. So this particular statute was designed to make it make usage of it practical for the average person. Now let's just connect this one step back to the militia. If you had a militia structure, number one, and you had a state depository, who would be executing the laws relating to that depository? Well, your state militia would be. That's how I draft the statute.
Aha.
And that would mean that was actually an instrumentality of the militia, so it couldn't be touched by the Treasury Department.
Ah.
Okay, now, you go to the second, and obviously collection of taxes, there's no way that the national government, the Treasury Department, could interfere with Texas or some state's collection of taxes in gold or silver. That's out of the question, okay? But, and there's actually a case that deals with that, Lane County versus Oregon. The Supreme Court already held that long ago, that the state did not have to accept legal tender paper money in payment of taxes if it was demanding the taxes should be paid in gold and silver. So there's no question of that. The question becomes, what happens to Ma and Pa Kettle, who are running, a grocery store or something, and they want to have a gold and silver account system? And what I proposed there was that the state would say to all the members of its militia, because it has direct control over them, as part of our economic security of our free state, right? Because that security word there's no adjective connected to it, right? Necessary to the security of a free state.
Right.
Security is a pretty broad word. So Texas, for instance, has a depository. It's controlled by the militia, and it says to all of and it's collecting taxes in gold and silver, and it's paying out taxes. It's paying out gold and silver to its creditors. Again, the Treasury can have no control over that. But now what we want to have happen is to have the gold and silver circulating within the private economy. Right? You can see the loop. That the state collects taxes in gold and silver. It pays out gold and silver to some of its creditors. The creditors then transact in gold and silver, and eventually that filters back into the tax loop. And so now that state is actually brought back onto a constitutional gold and silver, or silver and gold, we call it that way, constitutional silver and gold system.
Okay.
What about those people at the bottom of that loop? Ma and Pa Kettle were running the grocery store, and they would always potentially fear something along the line of the Franklin Roosevelt intervention,
Yes.
where the Treasury shows up and says, "No, you can't do that anymore. You're just individuals, right? We're going to stop you from doing that. We're going to seize that gold and silver." Well, no, they can't seize the gold and silver from the depository because that's a state institution,
Okay.
right? Well, what about Ma and Pa Kettle? Well, Ma and Pa Kettle, interestingly enough, most of them, they're members of the militia, right, from 16 to 55. And we can make that upper level, take it as far as we want in the statute. Maybe they don't have to be able-bodied, but they could perform some other militia function, such as an economic function for the militia. And so we tell all of these people, you're all militia members, and as militia members, here's what you're required to do in your business transactions in order to maintain economic security within our state, economic and monetary security in particular within our state. You are required to post not only your paper money prices, but gold and silver prices, or gold or silver, because I guess bread is not going to be sold in terms of gold. And we will give you all the software you need to tie into our depository. And you can tie this into your barcodes and whatever that you have on your goods and services, so that when people come to the checkout counter, they have a choice. They can pay in gold, they can pay in silver, they can pay in paper money. And your barcode reader will crank up those appropriate numbers. And then, of course, because you're operating through our depository, that'll be paid by some kind of depository credit card or other electronic means. You're not going to have bags of gold and silver to carry on, gold dust to carry around, right? And now, because you're doing this as a militia function, when the Treasury man comes and says, well, you can't have this in your mom and pop grocery store, oh, wait a minute. This is a militia function. We're performing a militia duty. You go talk to Colonel so-and-so at the depository. You see how that would remove that whole Roosevelt era problem would be removed overnight, because now what we're talking about here is a state institution which is controlling this monetary structure within the state economy.
Yeah, it's so difficult, that last point, because so much mileage has been gained in federal, some say overreach, because of the Commerce Clause, saying, anything in interstate commerce, then the feds do get to have say-so. So your argument about mom and pop Kettle's grocery store, if they're buying things across state lines, selling things across, don't we lose that state sovereignty there?
You see, once we get into these considerations, we have to look at two things. Number one provision of the Constitution cannot be used to undermine, override, whatever, defeat another provision of the Constitution.
All right.
Okay. So you look at the Commerce Clause and you ask the question at the militia level, can the Commerce Clause be used to override the militia? Let's go back to the gun point a moment. Can you use the Commerce Clause to tell people in Texas that they can't buy a gun for purpose of performing their militia duty? And the answer is, well, no. Commerce Clause can't be used to undermine the militia clauses of the Constitution.
Okay.
And in fact, that's what you find in the gun control statutes. You will find exemptions in the back of all of them, at the end of all of them, for the state
True.
agencies, whatever, instrumentalities of the states, however they've worded this, because they know damn well that they can't do that. They can't impose gun control on, say, state police. All right, take that as an example. They can't disarm the state police, those instrumentalities of the state. So they can't disarm the state militia, and they couldn't disarm the state militia anyway because Congress is supposed to arm the state militia. They have that circle, as it were, at the federal level. But if you come down to the Commerce Clause argument at the state level, yeah, these people are engaged in commerce, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the monetary unit. We're not. I mean, they could come in and say, "Well, you can't sell Wheaties for less than $1 a box." Let's assume that they did that. Right? You can't sell Wheaties for less than $1 a box. That's our Commerce Clause regulation. And the answer is, well, that's fine with us, but we're going to use gold and silver as the payment mechanism because it's a militia structure to maintain monetary security. Oh, and by the way, we have that reserved power in another place in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. No state shall make anything but what? Gold and silver coin, a tender in payment of debts. What kind of debts? Any kind of debt.
Right.
All right, if I buy a loaf of bread, at the moment that I put the bread down on the counter, a debt is being created. Right? When the person that runs that through on the barcode and it comes up on the computer screen, they're saying, you owe us $2 for that loaf of bread, right? So no state can make anything but gold and silver coin, a tender in payment of debts. All right, well, what are we doing here? This system, this monetary system, is doing that. It's making gold and silver coin ultimately because, as a Supreme Court case says, the only difference between coin and bullion is that the coin has a stamp on it, right, to certify the weight and purity.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so there really is no distinction between coin and bullion. As soon as you put them in the electronic system, where they're controlled by the state as to weight and purity and secured in some kind of depository, there's no functional difference. There can be no constitutional difference. So that's what the state is saying. I'm saying, well, we're going to make gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Now, we're not saying that Federal Reserve notes are not going to be a tender in payment of debts. We're not interfering with the supposed power of Congress there. And we're certainly not interfering with anything in normal commerce. We're giving people the option of paying in these other media, which we have a reserved constitutional power to do.
Right.
See, that's the important part in both of these. The militia is a reserved constitutional power. It's not something that's subject to Congress's control. It's simply there. The power of the states, the reserve power of the states to make gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, is a reservation out of the congressional power over money, whatever that might be. So whatever the Congress's power over money, we're not going to dispute that at this point. The states retain this power to make gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts.
Right.
And they can do it through this structure, this modern technological advance. And if they do it through the militia, that is, the militia maintaining this system, and the militia people out in the commercial world offering this other form of payment, or these other forms of payment, gold and silver, they're now within a domain over which Congress has no control at all.
I see that we're running out of time on this segment as well, and I'm just wondering if there's a way that we can circle back with you next time to talk about the future of practical application of this principle that you're describing here. You've talked about forays that have made in New Hampshire and in Montana and in Texas, people will want to know how they can support. Well, first of all, if they want to share the information that you've given us here, they can certainly share this video. Are there other specific articles or ways that that people can spread this information among like-minded friends and acquaintances so we can keep this ball moving forward?
Well, I think they have to spread what we've already talked about, basically.
All right. Are there any active legislators that they can throw their support behind?
No.
Is there anyone who can be encouraged in this area?
The last person who was really interested in this was Ron Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron Paul was, of course, one of the people, two people, he and Louis Lerman, who were on the Gold Commission in 1985, and were the ones who were instrumental in obtaining the recoinage or new coinage, as you were, of gold and silver, so the gold eagle system and the silver liberty system. Those are the products, and subsequent coins. Those are the products of the original 1985 legislation, which came out of the Gold Commission. What we're seeing now, or what I'm talking about now, is something that's come out of it's not recent. It's technology that came out in the last century, the end of the last century. This ability to have electronic valuation, electronic payment. I don't know who started it. There was gold money, James Turk's operation. There was some others. I assume that there are some others still today. And that's the key to the whole business. That the whole argument that was made against the use of gold and silver was that it was cumbersome, and that there were limited amounts of gold and silver. And with the electronic system, you say, look, it's not cumbersome anymore.
Right.
And the limited amounts, we can differ. We can make smaller and smaller payments, and we're not. This is the important point. We're not saying that we're going to remove paper money from the system. We're not talking about returning to that type of a system. You're going to have all the paper money you want. Let's let the market decide which one people will use and see what the consequences may be. And to protect that against the Franklin Roosevelt type of intervention, we need to use the reserve powers of the states, because Congress is not going to do this. Congress is wedded to the Federal Reserve System. And Congress is wedded to not use gold and silver as normal day-to-day currency. It's out there, and people buy it, and they put it in safe deposit boxes, right? But they're not paying their debts with it. Congress is not interested in that. The states have the authority to make that system available, and then we see what happens. Okay, so we're not trying to impose something here. We're saying states have reserve powers in certain areas. We want to exercise those powers, give some options to people and protections, so that they not only can they use these things, but they're going to be protected against intervention, against the prevention of it, and see what happens. This is the scientific approach, right? And the thesis is, or the experimental prediction is, that if we do this, there will be increasing pressure in the economy moving in the direction of gold and silver, moving away from paper money. The banks will have to regularize their operations. Right. The first thing the banks would start to do, well, they're doing it now with some of the cryptocurrencies, right? Bitcoin and others. Some of the banks are talking about putting accounts in for those, or at least treating those as if they were currencies. So you see the banks moving in a direction, I would think, the economically sound direction. And then at some stage, Congress would catch up. What was the WAG said? I saw this a while ago. The opposite of progress is Congress.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but Dr. Vieira, we're going to want to circle back with you on both these topics, because there are like 3 or 4 areas in each of them that you mentioned, and I wrote down notes that I wanted to delve in, but we just ran out of time. We just wanted to thank you, as always, for joining us. And if people want to follow your work, where should they get plugged in?
Well, they can go to newswithviews.com. I've got a big archive there. They can see what I've done. And I'm slowly but surely, I put new things up as the spirit moves me.
Excellent. Well, we've been speaking with Dr. Edwin Vieira, constitutional attorney, expert on not only the Second Amendment and constitutional money, but a lot of other things that are of vital interest to a well-regulated free state, and the rights of people within that state, and the good of our nation as a republic. We want to thank you again on behalf of all of our viewers, Dr. Vieira. Just thank you deeply for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
My pleasure, Dunning. Thank you.
If you've decided that now is the right time for you to protect your family's financial future by acquiring physical precious metals, gold and silver, I'm delighted to let you know that I have now become a licensed dealer's representative for Miles Franklin, one of the oldest and most trusted names in bullion dealerships. And we can provide you with physical delivery to your personal possession or to professional vault storage or precious metals IRAs. Just email me at libertyandfinance@protonmail.com, and please include your name and phone number in your email to libertyandfinance@protonmail.com. We'll get right back with you and find out how to best meet your needs so that you can either begin or increase your acquisition of physical precious metals now and protect your family's future starting today.
To acquire gold and silver, just go to libertyandfinance.com. When the main site comes up, click on Bullion Sales. That's libertyandfinance.com, Bullion Sales. You'll see my name, Dunnigan Kaiser, my phone number, and my associate, Kaiser Johnson, his phone number, our email, libertyandfinance@protonmail.com.